Hey guys, this is Paul, and this is another episode of Game Dev Paradise. Alright, so what are we going to talk about today? Today we're going to talk about what is a game loop. So this is a, I guess a sort of a basic element. It pretty much exists in every game, in many applications. Not every application, but in many applications there is some kind of a loop. So what is a loop? A loop is something in terms of coding, a loop is a bunch of code that loops in on itself. So for example, you have something like this. Print, first you declare a number, integer number equals 0. Then you say number is equal to number plus 1. Then you say print number. Actually, let's just say output number. So these statements, if just taken at itself, would create a piece of data called number with the value of 0. Then it would take the value of number and it would add 1 to it, and then it would print out what that value is. So at the end of this, what we would see on screen is like 1, right? So then for a loop, we will do while continue, something like this, right? So now we have a loop while continue. This actually should exist outside of the loop, otherwise we just keep declaring 0 and we would just keep getting 1, 1, 1. But in this case, what would happen is we would get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whoops, 6, and then 7, 8, 9, 10 for infinity while continue is true. So while whatever here is true, do this. That's basically what a loop is. A bunch of code that loops in on itself. Not sure if there's a better way to phrase it. Loops in on itself, that loops until stopped. Maybe that's repeats until stopped. So maybe this is a better way of saying it. So a loop is a bunch of code that repeats until stopped, if stopped. Early games might not have a way to stop a loop. You might have to like go to task manager and then the game because you didn't add the code for exiting the game yet. So that's certainly possible that sometimes these loops will go on forever. Alrighty, so what is a game loop? Usually a game loop will be something like player input, usually a game loop will have something like this. Listen for player input, keyboard, mouse, joystick, controller. Advance the game world. Let's say if the player hits the jump button, then you would tell the player character to jump, and then showing that on the screen. This would be a very basic sort of game loop. So this will keep going, so the player could constantly add an input. The game world will be advanced. Let's say player might be moving, and then show it on the screen. So let's take a look at a very basic game loop in action. Let's bring up Void Destroyer 2. So in Void Destroyer 2, you get to fly a spaceship, do space combat, things like that. But But while you're docked at a base, you can actually walk around it a little bit. So let's load up a saved file. Here we are in a hangar. So the game loop is already running. All the stuff you saw there was a game loop. I can exit out of this game loop by hitting escape, exit to main menu. I'm actually ended that game loop right there, right? So it's more advanced than beginning games where you can't exit. But so the game loop here, or the docked loop, while docked loop, is listening for player input. Right now I'm holding down the mouse button. I can look around the hangar, pressing the W key so I can move forward. So the game loop is listening for my input. If I approach something, something might happen. You know, a message on the screen here telling us that this door is for base owners only. If I go to another door, it opens. You know, so the game world reacts to the player. So I guess you could say this is like a walking simulator type of game right now while you're docked. Of course, when we undock, things become a lot more elaborate. Just as a comparison, there's spaceships. You can shoot, change different cameras. You got afterburners. All these quite a lot more elaborate stuff. And of course, you can dock with the base. Just to show you a comparison. So, I hope that I explained what a game loop is. I hope that I showed a very basic sort of a game loop. And now let's look at the code here. So let's close all this stuff. Let's look at the docked code. Here we are. Here's the docked code. Usually the way I name stuff is I have the function called action. I chose this name quite a while ago. I'm not sure if I got it from somewhere else or if I came up on this name by myself. I'm not even sure. But this function is basically my loop here, or is a part of my loop. I'll kind of get into that in a little bit. But basically, this keeps happening over and over while we're docked. Now this is a little more sophisticated because um, there's different like you can be in the mission screen or in another screen, but let's just basically focus on this. So let's look at this. Handle docked hangar common. Here we give we handle the camera, we handle the physics, we handle ship swap, which is that elevator you saw coming up and down. We handle those proximity doors that you saw opening and closing. But there's actually a lot more to this because over here in this other piece of code, this called game state, there is a docked state right here. And this action corresponds to, whoops, of course if I could spell right, this action. So inside a game state, we call this action. Of course, that's, you know, we handle the dock elements here, physics, player moving, things like that. But here, if we look some more, we also handle music. We also handle stuff with the GUI. And also, there is a render one frame. Let's find this guy up. There's this element as well, which we want to find in another spot. Yeah, even my very basic, whatchamacallit, is actually pretty complicated. But here we can see kind of what I was talking about. A very, the sort of while, keep playing, and then execute the commands here. So here we see while don't shut down. Do all these different things, capture input, do this update element, which corresponds to here. And then, of course, all these things happen, including this docked action. And then render one frame. At the end of this loop, we render one frame. And we calculate the time since the last frame for other elements. But basically, this keeps doing this here. While keep playing, while don't shut down. Listen for player input, player movement, all these other things, and then show output on screen, which is here, render one frame. So this is your really sort of kind of an overview of what a game loop is. So it gets a lot more complicated because things are subdivided here. For example, in this menu state, right here in this menu state, there's also a loop. Listen for player input, clicking here, whatever. Render one frame on the screen. You can also exit out of this by exiting the game or starting a new game or loading another game. So there's all these loops all over the place inside this application called Void Destroyer, inside this game called Void Destroyer. And they keep doing their job. They keep listening for the player. They keep advancing the game world, like for example that ship moving down. They keep sending commands to various areas. They keep communicating with various areas, communicating with the player. There's all these things behind the scenes. Like here, you're seeing the physics debug. These white lines represent what the physics engine see. I can't bump into this ship. I can't go through it because the physics is saying, hey, wait a minute, we can't let you go in. Because that is a physical object here, just like we can't go into these walls. We can't fall through the floors. So all these things are happening behind the scenes in Void Destroyer 2 in the form of they live inside a game loop, and then sub loops, other loops calling other loops for a little bit, things like that. So behind the scenes, there's quite a lot of happening. Depending what kind of a game you have, you might have a much simpler game. You might have a much more complicated game. For example, a more complicated game would be a multiplayer game with clients and servers, whereas the player would only be running the client, potentially, and the server being somewhere, hosted by Amazon or whoever hosts servers these days, with other companies, or maybe the company is big enough where they own their own servers. So there's quite a lot of variety here, but basically, that is what a game loop is. No, I don't want to upload the photos to Steam there. There we go. So a game loop is a bunch of code that repeats forever until stopped. Looks something like this, encoding in sort of C++, but in many languages it kind of looks like this. Sometimes it looks like this. Do loop, I believe, or maybe do while. I forget my different how basic does it, but there's things like that. In basic also sometimes you would like do stuff like this. Where line 10, listen for player input, you know, line 20, player movement if applicable, line 30, showing output on screen. So these lines will be done sequentially. And then here on line 40, and this is just how we used to name things. Actually might be a little confusing. Just call it this, line 1, 2, and 3, 4. And then on line 4, go to 1, which zooms us back here. Listen for player input, player movement, showing output on screen. Line 4, go to 1, go back here, and just loop forever. And sometimes there's things like this. For example, if player wants to quit, exit loop, keep playing equals false. So here for listen for player input, this might be contained somewhere in here. If the player wants to quit, set keep playing to false. And now as it loops around, if this is false, it would jump out of this loop and for example, show end game screen. So what's interesting is what you gotta watch out for is the sequence of these things. For example, if keep playing equals false, these other things will still happen. Player movement, show output on screen. So what you might want to do is add a piece of code like this, which says continue, which means skip everything else and go back to the top of the loop. So don't actually execute any of this. If the player wants to quit, go here. While keep playing equals false, then this. So a lot of times with loops, you can get into trouble based on the order of events. And sometimes a lot of my bugs came from this, as an aside. All right. So let's take a look at a more advanced loop here, or more advanced component of this loop. Again, first we start here on this loop. We tell this to update, which is here, which is this update. Then depending on what we're doing, common game state updates. We tell world factory action. Here's our world factory. And this is where a lot of the magic happens. Handle suns, handle planets, handle asteroid bases, handle stations, gates, handle ships. And then here we have a list of ships. We tell ships, hey, action. If a ship is dying, we set a flag that it's about to be removed. That's important for some other elements, bug hunts. Handle object deactivation, like explosion or whatever, and things like that. All kinds of things. So this might be a little easier for you guys to understand if you're a little newer, or if I'm going too fast, or if it's just my stuff is just confusing to understand. But all these things are happening in what I call a world factory. Projectiles, mines, area of effect, cargo pods, asteroids, debris, physical attachments. Here's my explosion handler, which handles explosions, messages for the player, timers, things like that. So all these things called advance the game world are like all over the place right here. All these things. We look at projectiles, for example. Here I'm taking live projectiles. I have a separate thing for projectiles that aren't in the game world that I reuse. And then we say, hey, projectile, do your thing. Test if the projectile still hasn't timed out. tests for hit for the projectile right here. We say, hey, where are you? Did you hit something? Perform projectile bullet ray. If you did hit something, handle object hit. All these things that make up Void Destroyer 2 happen in a game loop. All right. So, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. With this video, I tried to keep it shorter. I tried to be a little more concise. You know, instead of going into too much detail, I try to kind of keep it higher level. If I do decide to make a different video again on the game loop, going into detail on these components, you know, that'll be the time for that. But other than that, thank you very much for watching. This has been Game Dev Paradise. If you have any feedback, questions, comments, let me know, and I'll talk to you later.